Okay, let's look at 5B. This is a very large one. Substandard. It says evaluate the major arguments of the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist concerning the form of government, factions, checks and balances, and the power of the executive, including the roles of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. So that's what we're going to look at. At the Constitutional Convention we talked about in the last video, the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia convention was held from May to September 1787, and they met in secret. They eventually drafted and signed the United States Constitution, but one of the things they had to do is ratify it. They had to ratify the Constitution, and to ratify means to vote approval of it. In other words, for approval, you needed 9 state conventions out of 13 to approve this new Constitution. So you needed 9 out of 13 states in convention to ratify or approve the Constitution. But before that happened, 2 groups are going to square off against one another over this new United States Constitution. One's going to support it, one's going to be totally against it. So after the Constitution was signed and approved by the delegates, 55 delegates who attended in Philadelphia, had to be ratified, and that was under Article 7 of the Constitution. That said how it had to be ratified or approved by 9 out of 13 special state conventions. And it was by no means was passage of it and approval through ratification certain at this time, and some people opposed it, the strong national government or stronger national government. So the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist are going to argue in public through speeches, through newspaper articles, through pamphlets and other writings, the merits and the not so good merits of a federal government, this new federal government. And that's what we're going to look at first. So who were they? The Federalists were merchants, bankers, shipping, and manufacturing interests. They're going to support this new federal constitution. They're going to want it ratified, and they're going to favor a large republic, and they want an executive that is limited but not too strong but not too weak either. And they're going to value order and protection of property over anything else. The Anti-Federalists were a different group. They come from an agricultural background, yeoman farmers mostly. They're going to favor a small local government, one that's close to you. They feared a government that was too remote from them, like Great Britain was 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, and they didn't know how that government could provide for them and know what their interests are and help them. So they wanted a smaller government under the new Articles of Confederation and leave sovereignty to the states because it was more local, more closer to their community. So that's what they liked. They feared a powerful executive and thought he'd be like King George III in Parliament. And they valued individual rights over the rights of the state. It's going to be the Anti-Federalists to say we need a Bill of Rights for this Constitution if we're going to accept it. And they're going to oppose a strong federal constitution. So let's look at the Federalists. The Federalists were James Madison is seated here. Here's Alexander Hamilton, and here's John Jay. That's the group called the Federalists. And there were other Federalists that supported this strong constitution, but when we talk about the Federalists in terms of who wrote the Federalist Papers, we talk about these 3 men. And we're going to look at, if you see the Federalist without it being italicized, that means we're talking about this group of men who supported, or people who supported, the Constitution. They believed the country would not survive without a strong central government. They saw Shays Rebellion as an example of that, and they're going to publish these Federalist Papers. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They're going to want this system of government here, a federalism system of government where power is shared. We talked about in the last video, between the national government and the state government having their own powers, and then having a shared set of powers they can both, so they both can rule over the people at the same time. This is what we refer to as a limited government. The Anti-Federalists did not trust this. One of the leaders of the Anti-Federalists was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, when he found out they were meeting in Philadelphia, he says, I believe I smell a rat, because he thought they were going to reverse the Articles of Confederation back to what they had with King George III in Parliament. In other words, individual rights and states' rights would be run over by this big conspiracy by the wealthy merchants. And he was the one in the Declaration, after the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, says, give me liberty or give me death. He's going to be one of the Anti-Federalists, and some of the quotes he's known for those. The Anti-Federalists are going to demand this Bill of Rights, believe the Constitution gave too much power to the national government, that it failed to provide or guarantee certain safeguards for individuals. Alright. And the next steps is evaluate the arguments between Anti-Federalists and Federalists concerning the form of government. We're going to look down here. The role of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. James Madison was 36 old, Alexander Hamilton was 32, John Jay was 42. These two men wrote most of the Federalist Papers. Madison wrote 29 of them. There's 85 in all, and Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of the papers. John Jay only 5. So James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are really considered the foremost of the Federalists, arguing for this strong federal government on the Constitution. The reason they wrote and the purpose for the Federalists, notice that it is italicized here and here, and that refers to the 85 essays, a collection of those essays, was to convince the people and the states to ratify, there's that word again, ratify, or to vote approval of the new U.S. Constitution. That's why they did this, to talk about its merits, to say why we needed it. Okay, so it says evaluate the form of government. The Federalists proposed the U.S. Constitution in a federal system. As a federal system, power is going to be shared between state and federal governments. Like in the video before, national government power would be limited to issues affecting the entire country. All other powers would be reserved to the states, and it would unite the states as one large continental nation. The Anti-Federalists argued that the proposed U.S. Constitution would create a powerful central government that would threaten individual liberties and states' rights, both individuals' liberties and states' rights. And Anti-Federalists favored a weak national government. They wanted a strong state government. They wanted important political powers to remain with the states. But they both liked republics, especially the Federalists. And then this Republican form of government, Anti-Federalist says the proposed U.S. Constitution would not work in a large nation with diverse interests. A republic works best in small nation with a homogeneous population, and they wanted this small republic left to the states. And the Federalist says the proposed U.S. Constitution will work in a large republic. It will fragment political power and then curb the threat posed by both the wealthy minority and the not so wealthy majority. And they wanted a large republic, a united, one government, so to speak, the United States. And we can look at the Federalist number 10 and read those. James Madison wrote 2 places here. He defines what a republic is. We've already done this before when we talked about Thomas Paine in a republic. We defined what a republic was. But here's how James Madison does it. He says, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, the delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. In other words, he said, we're going to have a government where there's no king, where there's representation for the people, and that people who represent us will be a small number of citizens, and then those representatives are going to be elected by the rest of us. So he defines here what a republic is in Federalist number 10. That's his words. Okay, and then we look here, it says the question resulting is whether small or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public will, The effect of a large republic is to enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be less likely to sacrifice it to temporary and partial considerations. He's talking about the people we elect to office here. And then he says the greatest number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of a large republican government extends the sphere and takes in a greater variety of parties and interests. Greater variety of parties and interests. He's talking about factions here. We're going to talk about in a few moments. And make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or, if such a common motive exists, it would be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Hence, it clearly appears that a republic controls the effective faction by large over a small republic, and is enjoyed by the Union over the states composing it. So he's saying that a large republic is going to protect us by having more people and more interest involved, and they're going to have to compete with one another, and what's going to happen is our liberty is going to be protected. So he's proposing a large republic here. Okay, let's look at factions, and if we turn back here and we look down here, he's talking about factions when he's talking about a variety of parties and interests. And the effects of faction, he says here, clearly appears that a republic controls the effects of faction by a large republic. Faction. Evaluate the major arguments of the Anti-Federalists and Federalists concerning government. Factions. And let's look at this. Anti-Federalists argue that proposed U.S. Constitution favor the wealthy men with money, men with means, men with property, and preserve their power. See, that's a faction, at the expense of the majority of the poor people. Well, the Federalists said that men of talent and experience should govern the nation. We're going to choose those men to be through election to rule over us. And they said that a mobocracy, that is the majority of the landless, people didn't have money or property, threatened the security of life and property of those who did, and that a national government would protect the rights of the people, both with and without land. Large republic would ensure that no one faction would take control of the government. And part of our Common Core standards say that we have to determine the meaning of words and phrases as they're used in a text, including analyzing. So we've got to determine the words, how they're used in text, and analyzing how an author uses and refines the meaning of a key term, that's one term, over the course of the text. So we're going to look at how Madison defined the word faction, this word faction that we just talked about, in the Federalist number 10. This is some of our Common Core stuff. You might have to write on this and understand this information. So let's look at how the word faction is used by James Madison in several phrases throughout the text, over the course of the text, number 10. Alright, here's how he defines faction. He says, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of an interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. In other words, what he's talking about here is he's talking about interest groups. He might be talking about political parties like the Republicans and Democrats or the Tea Party. Those types of interests with a common passion for one another and their own interest. That's what he's talking about. That's what a faction is. Let's look down here. Here's another way it says faction. It says those who hold and those who are without property have every form distinct interest in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes actuated by different sentiments and views. That's another way he talks about these interests are factions, are groups of people with this common interest to protect something. Okay, And then here's a third way he defines this word, faction. We see them everywhere, brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as of speculation, as of practice, and attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So those are three ways, different ways that James Madison defines what a faction is, or a party, or an interest group. Alright, another one is checks and balances. Evaluate the major arguments of the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist concerning the form of government, factions, checks and balances, and the power of the executive. Let's look at checks and balances real quick. The Anti-Federalists argued that the proposed U.S. Constitution favored the wealthy men and preserved their power at the expense of the majority. The rich would control people. The Federalists argued that a separation of powers in government into three different independent branches and their ability to check each other protected the rights of the people and ensures that no single group or person can control government by dividing it into separate branches and then giving it checks and balances over one another. We created checks and balances where no single person or group or interest gets control over government. Alright, so let's look at his Federalist number 50. Remember, there's 85 of these. Here's number 50. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You first must enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. He's talking about these checks and balances and separation of powers we're going to talk about. And he says that if angels were to govern men, we didn't need these, but we didn't have any angels. We had men over men, so we needed some checks. So nobody got too big for the britches. No one branch took control of government. So he says, to what expedient then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessity splitting it up, okay, of power, or separating it among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution, by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. He's talking about these separation of powers, checks and balances, keeping each one in their place so no one gets too powerful. Here's what he's talking about here. He's talking about dividing the government up into a legislative branch that makes or passes laws, and then an executive branch that carries out or executes the laws, and a judicial branch that interprets the law. He's talking about splitting it up in three different areas here. This is separation of powers here. Okay? Just like this. Alright, so let's go back here. He says, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. In other words, the government needs to depend on the people. But experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. In other words, we need these precautions. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interest. Factions are going to have rival and opposite interest. The defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs. In other words, it's human nature that we compete with one another and have rivalries opposite one another, private as well as public. We see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. And Federalist number 50, he's talking about checks and balances. How do you divide government up and give it checks and balances? So if we look back at this, you know, the president can, the Congress or the legislature can override the president's veto. The president can veto a law that's made by Congress, but then Congress can override it. If it becomes law and it's overridden by Congress, then it is the judicial branch that can declare that law unconstitutional. And the judicial branch can declare executive actions unconstitutional. And the president can propose laws and kind of influence Congress. So we see here we have these checks and balances as well as a separation of powers. And the checks and balances visual may look better like this. That they check one another out and make sure that no one branch becomes too powerful. Okay. Okay, so how do we limit government? We're going to talk about it in a few moments. Okay, and these are ways that you limit government. You separate power, and then you give it checks and balances against one another. Alright, the power of the executive, arguments of the power of the executive, the president in other words. Anti-Federalists favored a weak executive or none at all. Under the Articles there was no executive. There was a president, but he broke a tie vote. That's about it. A strong executive, like a commander-in-chief that had all these roles where he controlled a huge executive, would be similar to a monarchy, they said. Might keep a standing army, might become a tyrant, and they wanted state legislatures to elect the president if there was one, but wanted his power to be weak. They favored short presidential terms if we were to have one, and then favored limits on the number of terms that a president could serve. The Federalists, on the other hand, favored a strong executive. They wanted somebody to get something done. They wanted a direct election of the president by the people. And they favor a long presidential terms with no limits on the number of terms served. And in the original Constitution, they create the Electoral College. They agreed to choose the Electoral College to choose the president. That's part of one of their agreements. Alright, so let's explain, that's C. Okay, so we won't get it yet. So, did we meet our objective, evaluate the major arguments of the Anti-Federalist and Federalist concerning the form of government? Yeah, republic, large republic. Factions, you know, these interests, these political parties. Checks and balances, how do you keep them from getting too much powerful and one branch from becoming too powerful? The power of the executive, and we talked about the roles of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. So where do we get this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances? Where did James Madison get these ideas? He got them from Baron de Montesquieu. We talked about in the last couple of videos. And Montesquieu here wrote The Spirit of the Laws. He was a fabric of the Enlightenment, and he influences our separation of powers in government, a legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And he hints at checks and balances, and James Madison picks up on that and runs with it. So separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, here's this word Montesquieu. You know, this enlightened thinker, and people get Lafayette and Friedrich von Steuben and Montesquieu mixed up. Some of my kids, even though it's not academic, think of Monta as money. Money skews, they mispronounce it grossly, money skew, and they think of checks as being similar to money. So in this separation of powers and checks and balances, money skew, but his name is Montesquieu, and that's how they associate the two and remember them for the test. Okay, I hope 5B, I hope you got 5B down, and I hope you understand the difference between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist now, and go back and watch this video if you don't. And I hope that this 5B, evaluate the major arguments between them and understand them and all these different issues. You can go back and look at this. Make sure you understand these things for the test, okay? Alright. Individual rights over the rights of the state. It's going to be the Anti-Federalists to say we need a Bill of Rights for this Constitution if we're going to accept it. And they're going to oppose a strong federal Constitution. So let's look at the Federalists. The Federalists were James Madison is seated here. Here's Alexander Hamilton. Here's John Jay. That's the group called the Federalists. And there were other Federalists that supported this strong Constitution. But when we talk about the Federalists in terms of who wrote the Federalist Papers, we talk about these three men. and we're going to look at. If you see the Federalist without it being italicized, that means we're talking about this group of men who supported, or people who supported, the Constitution. They believed the country would not survive without a strong central government. They saw Shays' approval through ratification certain at this time, and some people opposed it, the strong national government, or stronger national government. So the anti-federalists and the federalists are going to argue in public, through speeches, through newspaper articles, through pamphlets and other writings, the merits and the not so good merits of a federal government, this new federal government. And that's what we're going to look at first. So who were they? The Federalists were merchants, bankers, shipping, and manufacturing interests. They're going to support this new federal constitution. They're going to want it ratified, and they're going to favor a large republic, and they want an executive that is limited but not too strong but not too weak either. And they're going to value order and protection of property over anything else. The anti-federalists were a different group. They come from an agricultural background, yeoman farmers mostly. They're going to favor a small local government, one that's close to you. They feared a government was too remote from them, like Great Britain was 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, and they didn't know how that government could provide for them and know what their interests are and help them. So they wanted a smaller government under the new Articles of Confederation and leave sovereignty to the states because it was more local, more closer to their community. So that's what they liked. They feared a powerful executive and thought he'd be like King George III in Parliament. And they valued, ratify means to vote approval of it. In other words, for approval, you needed 9 state conventions out of 13 to approve this new constitution. So you needed 9 out of 13 states in convention to ratify or approve the Constitution. But before that happened, 2 groups are going to square off against one another over this new United States Constitution. One's going to support it, one's going to be totally against it. So after the Constitution was signed and approved by the delegates, 55 delegates who attended in Philadelphia, had to be ratified. And that was under Article 7 of the Constitution that said how it had to be ratified or approved by 9 out of 13 special state conventions. And it was by no means was passage of it. Okay, let's look at 5B. This is a very large one. Substandard. It says evaluate the major arguments of the anti-federalist and the federalist concerning the form of government, factions, checks and balances, and the power of the executive, including the roles of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. So that's what we're going to look at. At the Constitutional Convention we talked about in the last video, the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia was held from May to September 1787, and they met in secret. They eventually drafted and signed the United States Constitution, but one of the things they had to do is ratify it. They had to ratify the Constitution.